guys, welcome back to Children's Church. We're going to have another week of playing this or that, where you guys get to try to guess what's going to be the next thing that happens in the story, this or that. We're looking at the life of Paul again and one of his really bad days that he had. You know, it was so hard for him to share Jesus with the world because he went through awful stuff for his faith. He was persecuted, he was stoned, he went through something really bad that we're going to look at today, and he did it all for Jesus. He was the man that used to kill Christians and watched as Stephen was stoned, and now he was the one who was suffering for Jesus. But you know what? He did it with a glad heart, and I'm really encouraged by his life and everything that he teaches us. Now, we're going to play a little warm-up game before we get into our Bible story, and it's another this or that game. We're going to look at what bad things could happen in a day and what you think would be worse, this or that. Let's look at this. What if you have big rocks thrown at you? Would that be worse than being chased by dangerous robbers? Or what about going days without food, water, and sleep? Would you rather go through that or stand in the cold with no clothes on? Yikes. Would you rather be put in jail for 6 years? Or would you rather be hit with a whip 195 times? Would you rather be bitten by a venomous snake? Or would you rather be shipwrecked on an island? All of these things are awful things, and I'm not sure what you shared with your family and which was worse. But I know that all of them, they were terrible. I wouldn't want to even go through one of them. But you know what? Paul went through all of them. He suffered so much to serve Jesus. And we're going to look at one of his stories today where he had a really bad, no good day at all. Let's take a look. Well, we're going to start our story today with Paul sharing the gospel and going on his missionary journeys with some friends of his and sharing about Jesus. And you know what we read in Scripture is that the church grew and grew and grew. It's amazing to me how people followed Jesus so readily. It's a real testimony to the truth of the gospel. You know, these people chose to follow Jesus even though they knew they were going to be persecuted, even though they knew that their life was at risk for doing it. Yet they put their faith in Jesus and their lives were changed, and they continued to do it even though they were at risk. And you know, who put them at risk and who was the problem was the Jewish leaders. They never accepted Jesus. We know that from before. And they did not accept Paul's message either. And so they were always around in every town that he shared the gospel in. They would show up or they would already be there. And they would be fighting with Paul to not share about Jesus and that gospel. And so I want you guys to tell me what happened next, okay? They're mad at Paul. They don't want him to do this. So is the answer that the Jewish leaders warned Paul not to talk about Jesus, or that the Jewish leaders had Paul arrested? You tell me, which one do you think it is? This or that? Well, the answer is that the Jewish leaders arrested Paul. They thought he was a troublemaker. They hated this gospel about Jesus Christ, and they saw how it was spreading and people were believing it, and so they wanted him put to death. But you know what? There was something special about Paul. He was a Roman citizen, and that meant that he had the right to have a trial. They couldn't just kill him. He had the right to prove that he was innocent. And in order to do that, he had to go all the way to Rome. Now, I want you to tell me the next part of the story. How did he get there? Did he have to sail there on a ship? Or did they chain him to a chariot and make him walk all the way there? Was it this or that? You tell me. Well, the answer is that Paul was put on a ship and sailed to Rome with some other prisoners. Now, as they were sailing, something not good happened. What would be the worst thing that could happen when you are out at sea? There was a storm. And it was a hurricane force kind of storm, the kind that is really scary when you're out on a ship in the middle of the sea. And as the storm went on, the waves got worse, and they beat against that ship. They beat against that ship so bad that the sailors thought, we're all going to die. Well, Paul went to the Lord and prayed. And then he said something to the people. Was it this? We must run the ship onto the beach of some island, or that? We must turn the ship around and sail for home. What do you think? This or that? Well, in Acts 27, we can find the answer to this. Paul says, I belong to God and serve him. Last night his angel stood beside me. The angel said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must go on trial in front of Caesar. God has shown his grace in sparing the lives of all those sailing with you. Men, continue to be brave. I have faith in God. It will happen just as he told me. But we must run the ship onto the beach of some island. That's the answer. God wanted them to run the ship onto the beach of some island. There was a purpose for this. So they had to trust Paul's word in that. Well, do you think everybody did? No, not everybody did. The sailors were not convinced of what Paul was saying, and they were scared that the ship would break up into pieces. So they pretended that they were going to go lower anchors down, and instead they went and quietly lowered down a lifeboat with just them in it. Well, there were soldiers still on the ship and the other prisoners and who knows who all else, and the rest of the people would die without the sailors there. So Paul, seeing what was happening, went and told the soldiers. Now you have to tell me what happened next, this or that. Did the soldiers kill the sailors for trying to leave the ship? Or did the soldiers cut the lifeboat loose and let it float away empty? You tell me. Well, if the sailors were all gone, then the ship would have sunk. Who would sail it, right? So the soldiers cut the lifeboat loose and let it sail away with nobody in it. Okay, so that's the answer there. When morning came, something wonderful happened though. They noticed that there was an island with a sandy beach, just as Paul had told them. And so they decided to do what he said, and they wanted to make the ship go aground onto that beach. But before they could get there, something bad happened. The ship got caught on the sandy bottom. It couldn't go all the way to the beach, and the big waves started pounding on the back of it, the Bible said, and it started to break apart. It did start to break apart. So what happened next? Was it this? The soldiers planned to kill Paul and the other prisoners? Because if prisoners got away, the soldiers were usually killed. That's why they would do that. Or that the soldiers abandoned the ship and left the prisoners to die. What do you think? Well, the answer is that the soldiers planned to kill Paul and the other prisoners so that they couldn't escape. Because like I said, if they lost prisoners, they were in trouble, and they didn't want to be killed for losing the prisoners. But the commander was a friend of Paul. He'd come to respect Paul, and he stopped the soldiers from following their plan and killing the prisoners. And instead, he said, anyone that can jump into the water and swim and get to shore that way, do it. And anyone else who can't swim, hang on to planks, broken pieces of the ship as it breaks apart, and get yourself to shore. And the Bible tells us that every single person made it to shore. There were almost 300 people on that ship, and every one of them made it. Nobody died. That in itself is a miracle. And I actually love how that story continued. Paul, he ended up getting bitten by a viper and living through that, and it didn't even swell up. Another miracle. God was protecting Paul. He had a plan. He wanted Paul in Rome, and so Paul was going to get there. Nothing was going to stop that. That's the power of our God. Let's look at some questions now and just learn more about Jesus through this story. Well, guys, here's a big question. If God can stop storms, why do you think he didn't stop the storm that Paul was in? If Paul was doing all of this for God, do you think God should have made it easier for Paul? Why do you think this? Discuss it with your family for a minute. Whoa, when I look at this kind of day for Paul, I've never been through anything that bad. You know, when we look at 2 Corinthians, Paul writes and tells us all the different things he went through. Let's take a look at that together. Paul spent 6 years in prison. He was hit with a whip 195 times. He was beaten with rods and struck with stones. He was shipwrecked. He was bitten by a venomous snake. He was in danger from rivers and robbers. He went days without food, water, and sleep. And he was left in the cold with no clothes. And he went through all of it so people could hear about the good news of Jesus. How do you think Paul felt after going through all of these things? In the Bible, Paul says that he felt weak. Do you think being weak is a good thing? You might not think so, but Paul said being weak is a good thing. He explains why in our Bible verse for today, so let's take a look at it. But he said to me, "My grace is all you need. My power is strongest when you are weak. So I am very happy to brag about how weak I am. Then Christ's power can rest on me." 2 Corinthians 12:9. That's kind of strange, isn't it? To be glad when you are weak? Let's try to understand this better. So Paul says when we are weak, that's when God is strong. That's when his strength can be seen in us. Well, how can this be? Let's compare it to these two gloves. I found this one in my storage room, in the youth storage room, and I think it's for sumo wrestling, but you know what? It's kind of a strong glove, it seems. Like, it would be a lot of protection, I guess, if you were going to fight somebody. But let's see how it is compared to this glove. Now, this glove is kind of floppy. It's weak. Which one do you think is more useful to the person with the hand? This glove or this glove? If we're comparing God to be the hand and us to be the glove, we need to be weak. We need to be moldable so that he can do what he wants with our lives. So when we are weak, then he is strong. It's because he is able to work in us when we realize we can't do it on our own. And that's what Paul was talking about. We need to be weak so that we allow God to do what he wants to do in our lives and for him to have his way. We can see why Paul rejoiced in his terrible, horrible, no good, very bad days. Because when he was weak, God was strong. When we look at our shipwreck story, there were 276 people on that ship. That's the exact number that was on that ship. And 276 people made it through the kind of ocean that was beating against a ship, breaking a big ship apart into all these pieces. You'd think somebody would have drowned. Typically, that's what would have happened, but there was a miracle and nobody drowned. I can't help but think that some came to the Lord after that, after witnessing his power and saving them. And that's where when Paul was weak, when he couldn't do anything to save anyone, God stepped in and showed his power. And that's the same as in our lives. When we are weak, God steps in and he shows his power and he takes over. And when he takes over, that's the best way to live. He's perfect and we can trust him. Let's remember that, guys. We will see you next time and in person. I'm so excited that the next time we meet, I get to teach you in person. We get to hang out. I've bought a really cool game that you're going to love that we can do together after a Bible story in Children's Church. And it's going to be fun. So anyway, see you then. Bye.